the last few months undertaken a statewide data collection initiative, which seeks to determine how it is that Connecticut's women were impacted by COVID-19 so that we can take those lessons learned and move forward in a much more robust and resilient way. So without anything further, I would love to welcome Tina Corpus in just a second. But first, what I'm going to do is recognize our esteemed member of our commission, Tony Moran. Hi, Tony. If you could just unmute.
Hi, Steve. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with the commission I've been thinking of as our mother commission, or sister commission, or some odd relationship, made even odder by the fact that I chaired the permanent commission when it was a state agency for 4 years. So it's a great pleasure to have you here and a great pleasure to hear your report. One of the true hallmarks of the permanent commission's work was its reliance on data collected both on Connecticut and on women nationally as well. All of their programs and our programs have been very much based on the demonstrated reality of women's experience. So I'm really pleased to have you here and look forward to hearing what you had to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, and welcome, Tina.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Tony. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tina Corpus, and I'm the Executive Director of the Permanent Commission on the Status of Women in Connecticut. Today, we're here to present our findings of a survey entitled The Economic Impact of COVID-19 on Connecticut's Women. As you've heard, the PCSW was founded as a state agency beginning in 1973 and for 47 years engaged in research, advocacy, and landmark legislation on behalf of Connecticut's women and girls. In 2016, the PCSW was reincorporated as two nonprofit corporations from which we continue our work today. We continue to work side by side with the CWC SEO, which is our successor at the state level. And we are so grateful to them for being a partner in our work from the beginning of our history to the present day. We remain a bipartisan organization with a nonpartisan mandate. Last spring, with the data beginning to come in on the national level about the child care system in crisis, women being laid off and leaving the workforce in record numbers, the recession was nicknamed the she-cession because of the disparate impact on women. So the PCSW saw an opportunity to do what it has always done and provide primary research about Connecticut women's experience. Between October 5th, 2020 and February 5th, 2021, we conducted statewide research to assess this question. We came to this body, the CWC SEO, on December 8th, 2020, as we were collecting our data. We described our work and encouraged many listeners to take the survey and attend our forums, and many of you did, and we thank you. You will hear today about the report and our findings. Of great importance to this work was the involvement of Susan Tolliver, who is a professor emerita of sociology and women's studies at Iona College and a PCSW board member. Susan served as a commissioner of the former PCSW state agency and has authored numerous publications on women, families, Black life, and culture. Susan assisted the PCSW in all aspects of this research, including development of the survey questions, synthesis of our data, and presentation of our final results. I would now like to turn it over to Susan, who will discuss the methodology used.
Thank you, Tina, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted Connecticut's women in numerous and various ways. In order to identify and understand these impacts, we engaged in original research and generated data not available elsewhere, which includes the details of real women's stories. This renders our project and the data generated unique, and our mixed methods approach yielded results that are rich and richly qualitative and richly quantitative and yielded that type of information. The purpose of our study was to identify and assess the economic impact of COVID, of the pandemic, on Connecticut women in 5 select areas. The mixed methods approach that was utilized for the data collection was the use of a written survey and the conducting of statewide focus groups. We prepared a written 30-item questionnaire and distributed this survey instrument through every distribution channel. Connecticut legislators, over 200 women's organizations across Connecticut, government commissions, through town halls, via email and social media. Our survey questions focused on 5 areas of inquiry, which you can see listed on the slide. The survey was available electronically and in hard copy in English and in Spanish. The number of respondents to the survey is 1,020, representing 174 zip codes across Connecticut. We held 10 focus groups across the state, 6 in each of Connecticut's counties. Hartford and Litchfield were combined, Tallinn and Wyndham were combined, and 4 private forums, 3 in an educational setting and 1 in a nonprofit service provider context. In the focus groups, attended by over 100 women, participants were asked to identify the ways in which COVID-19 had most impacted them. In the course of that process, participants told their stories, and many of their voices are quoted in the report and in the Voices of Connecticut's Women pages of the report. I would now like to offer a few remarks about the data itself and the survey respondent pool. The PCSW analyzed the survey respondent pool against 4 diversity metrics: race, household income, age, and geography, in order to ascertain whether the sample was truly representative of Connecticut's women across these 4 metrics. The slide shows the racial ethnic makeup of the state of Connecticut overall compared to the racial ethnic makeup of our survey respondent pool. While the numbers or on the slide are small and hard to read, if you read the report, you will see that those census race and ethnicity categories are closely mirrored in both data sets. We examined our data set across household income lines, geographic lines, and age. Again, we felt comfortable that the women in the PCSW survey sample pool mirrored that of Connecticut against these important measures. I should state that importantly, with respect to geography, as evidenced in the map on the slide, 75% of our participants were from 3 counties, Fairfield, Hartford, and New Haven, in which 75% of the state's population resides. The data was collected over a 5-month period between October 5th and February 5th, 2020 to 2021, during which all of the surveys were taken and all of the focus groups were conducted. The red bar charts at the bottom show how many survey responses were submitted in each of the months between October and February. The charts on the right show the context in which Connecticut women were living during this period. The shaded red triangles represent the October-February period overlaid on top of 3 important indicators: number of COVID-19 cases, number of COVID-19 deaths, and 3 economic indicators: unemployment, housing, and food insecurity. As you can see, the winter surge, complete with rising COVID cases and deaths and volatility in these important indicators, is captured in our data. We felt it was important that the economic shocks felt during the winter surge and the cumulative effects of that surge on 9 prior months of economic impact were important parts of a robust picture of the economic impact of the pandemic on Connecticut's women. I would now like to turn this presentation over to Tina Korpis again, who will take us through the key findings of our report.
Thank you, Susan. Of the working women in our survey, 26.5% were furloughed or lost their jobs due to COVID. Our findings in this category had variability across racial and ethnic lines. While the percentage of white and Asian women who lost their jobs or were furloughed was below the survey average, women of 2 or more races and Latina women fared worse at 47.4% and 37.9% respectively. There was also variability when viewed across household income lines. As the bar chart on the bottom right shows, for women below the federal poverty line for Connecticut, which is approximately $35,000 a year, they both lost jobs and were furloughed more frequently than the pool average, more frequently than the higher income categories as well. The PCSW asked survey respondents whether their total monthly income from all sources had increased, decreased, or stayed the same due to COVID. This refers to their work, their pay from work, pension, investment income, spousal benefits, and other categories. As the chart indicates, total household income decreased for 33.0% of survey respondents. When asked to quantify the extent of the decrease, as you can see, the median decrease in our pool sample was $500 to $750 a month. For some of our respondents, their total monthly income increased due to COVID. But as you can see, even where this happened, the median decrease was larger than the median increase. The median decrease in total monthly income of $500 to $750 per month equates to approximately $6,000 to $9,000 a year. With a median household income of $75,000, this is approximately 10% of household income. Income loss was felt differently across race and ethnicity. As you can see from the middle box here, Latina and women of 2 or more races fared worse than the pool average. A third key theme of this section was the impact of COVID on women's ability to work or return to work. It will come as no surprise to anyone that 68.2% of all women in the respondent pool reported this impairment. The largest driver of this impairment was a change to their work situation, meaning a change in their hours, they lost their job, a change in their work circumstances, etc. But factors 2, 3, 4, and 5 driving this issue across the entire respondent pool were the categories of childcare, children at home, homeschool demands, and other home work. When we explored this finding further, looking exclusively at those women who had dependent children in their home, these factors became more significant. 66.1% of women with dependent children cited the demands of home work to be an impediment to their ability to work or return to work. The effect of increased home demands on women's ability to work was a theme in all of our forums and a top 3 concern in most forums. Women described making the decision to leave the workforce, deciding as a family to downshift as their career was the lower paying within the couple, and the difficult decision between supporting their children's education or going back to work. In the last question of our survey, we asked women to state the single factor that would most contribute to their economic recovery post-COVID. In this final question, there were no answer choices, only a blank write-in box where women could furnish their own response. The single most cited factor, accounting for 29.6% of the pool overall, was the need for support in balancing work and childcare responsibilities. This category outranked the need for federal or state relief, which was the second most cited category. Of the women who reported that their work situation had been impacted, 16.1% said that their ability to advance in their careers and be promoted had been impacted. This number indicates a more far-reaching and long-term effect after the pandemic, including dropping out of the workforce, downshifting, change in job, and the prospects for recovering that income, tenure, and potential. Particularly impacted, as you can see from this line chart in the bottom left, was the 25 to 45-year-old age group, with 28% of them reporting this setback compared to the pool average of 16.1. When we looked at women in this category, 70% of them had dependent children, younger than 18 in their homes. So not only are they at a stage in their careers where they are building their credentials and seniority, but they are also disproportionately likely to have not only dependent children, but young dependent children in their homes. The next category on which the report focused was housing and food security. 21.3% of the survey respondent pool reported a decrease in their ability. 21.3% reported that their housing security had been impacted, and 11.5% reported a decreased ability to buy food. These two factors, as you would expect, were highly correlated with household income level. So for example, while 21.3 and 11.5% overall cited these impairments, 40% and 34% of women with household incomes under 20,000 a year experienced these impairments. This is represented by the bar chart at the bottom left, where you can see housing and food insecurity diminish as total household income rises. The effect of COVID on Connecticut's women housing and food security varied slightly across Connecticut's 8 counties. As the charts on the right show, Tallinn and New London counties had higher than average housing and food insecurity due to COVID, with Tallinn County respondents experiencing the highest level of food insecurity among the state's 8 counties. In the section on health and healthcare, we asked respondents whether their healthcare had been impacted by COVID across a variety of factors, including a decrease in their insurance coverage, a decreased ability to afford routine care, or a loss of insurance coverage. The PCSW aggregated all of these factors and all of the respondents who cited one or more, and 35.4 stated that they had experienced this. The results were heterogeneous across racial and ethnic lines. Whereas 35.4% of respondents overall experienced an impairment to their health care, Latina women and women of 2 or more races suffered more at 43.9 and 49.0% respectively. When viewed across socioeconomic lines, as you would expect, those women under Connecticut's poverty line had the greatest impact on their health care coverage and accessibility. Over 50% of women with household incomes below $35,000 reported a detriment in their healthcare coverage compared to the survey average of 35. This is the red line. The impact overall peaks here at the $20,000 to $35,000 level and decreases as household income increases. We asked survey respondents whether they developed a number of health issues as a result of COVID. 59.3% reported that they had experienced one or more of these, and the data showed variation across racial and ethnic lines. White and Black women were less likely to suffer a health impairment than the average of 59.3, but Latina, Asian, and women of 2 or more races were more likely to suffer. With respect to the respondents' physical health, 12.7% of respondents reported that they themselves were sick from COVID. This was roughly comparable to the incidence of COVID in Connecticut's population overall at the time the survey concluded. The PCSW also asked whether respondents had experienced a family member sick from COVID. Again, the survey average was 22.1%, with Latinx and women of 2 or more races reporting higher incidences than the pool average. This is an area where we heard some very difficult stories in our public forums. One young woman in our Hartford County forum reported that she had lost 17 members of her family to COVID. No single factor showed more uniformity across racial, household income, age, and geographic categories, as did the reporting of the mental health impact of COVID-19. This scatter plot takes every race category in our survey, every household income level, age, and geographic category, and plots it in one place. As you can see by a clustering of all of these shapes at the top half of the graph, there was not a category that dropped below a reporting of 28.5% of those women affected in their mental health. In 5 of the 6 county-wide forums, mental health impairment was cited as a top 3 concern. Participants experienced guilt over reduced productivity at work, difficulty juggling professional and family life, isolation and lack of outlets, stress over compromised college and job prospects. This was particularly among our college students, the combined effect of COVID-19 with the Black Lives Matter movement and other societal disruptions of 2020, and finally, anxiety and fear due to the constant need to adapt and grief over the loss of loved ones. We asked survey respondents whether they or someone they knew was in a domestic violence situation, and 14.1% replied yes. We further asked what the impact of COVID had been on those situations. The pie chart on the left takes the 14.1% of survey respondents and divides those women into situations which worsened, began, pre-existed, and had no change, or improved after COVID. I should state that we placed a stake in the ground at March 15th, 2020 as a date and time to assess what was pre and what was post-COVID. In 49.8% of cases, which are these clear black and red slices of the pie, the situations either began or worsened during COVID. Our data further confirmed what domestic violence advocates have often cited, and that is that domestic violence is a problem that spans household income levels. The red bar on this chart shows the percentage of women in that income category that reported domestic violence. The gray and black bars show the percentage in that category for whom the situation worsened or began during COVID. As you can see, there does not appear to be a correlation in the survey pool between lower household income level and percent experiencing domestic violence, except that in the 101,000 and above category, the incidence of all three of these negative factors is the highest. Finally, in education, 68.5% of survey respondents who were themselves or had a student in their household reported an impairment to their educational progress. When we got behind the drivers of what was causing that, inability to pay tuition and inability to access their education virtually were the top two drivers. Negative educational impact by age also showed pronounced disparities across the survey pool. The categories of 18 to 25-year-olds, 35 to 45, and 46 to 55-year-olds reported the highest percentages of negative impact. As one would expect, roughly half of those in the 18 to 25-year-old category were students themselves, late high school or college. And over 75% of those in the age categories of 35 to 55 had school-age children. Not only were these age groups affected most relative to the overall pool, but were more effective even relative to those who reported a negative impact. Finally, the effect of COVID on Connecticut's women along this measure was correlated with household income level. Women in lower incomes levels disproportionately reported that they were unable to access their education virtually and were less able to continue paying tuition. We presently find ourselves in an intermediate stage of the pandemic, out of the winter surge with cases decreasing, restrictions lifting. Therefore, what we're presenting today are our recommendations as they existed when the report was released in mid-April. But we've happily updated many of our recommendations for activity that has occurred in the General Assembly, with the session of which is now concluded, and areas which have already experienced forward movement as a result of federal relief money. The report's overall conclusions, if we had to single out a single area in which we heard the most feedback from Connecticut's women, it would be in the area of work and pay, specifically the child care crisis that pre-existed COVID, but was exacerbated by the COVID epidemic. Because of that, our recommendations begin with a number of recommendations in the area of child care. $210 million of federal stimulus money was allocated by the Lamont administration towards the child care and early childhood education space in March. Specifically, the PCSW supports expanding the Care for Kids program, which is Connecticut's current child care program for working parents, not only to those parents who are already working, but to cover 90 days of coverage available to program participants who are in training to receive their first job. This has been covered by federal relief for 18 to 24 months, starting in the spring of 2021 and continuing until the spring of 2023. We also support the full implementation of the Paid Family Medical Leave Act, which is also in progress. The next 2 years of federal stimulus provide an opportunity to pilot programs, develop a track record, and establish longevity so that the cliff, which occurs in 18 to 24 months, by the time the cliff occurs in 18 to 24 months, we will have adequate data of which of those federally funded programs worked, which did not, and which we hope to establish in the long term for Connecticut. We also support efforts to eliminate the gender wage gap. As you saw from the numbers of women furloughed or losing their jobs and the loss in household income, the roughly $400,000 over the course of a woman's career of savings that she would have less than a man covering that same job is exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. In the area of housing and food security, we support Unite CT, which was enacted in March of 2021 to provide financial support for renters and payment of utilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. This also supports temporary mortgage forbearance in the form of a temporary suspension or reduction to promote homeowner stability. In the area of healthcare, we support expanding access to telehealth services and encouraging insurance companies to reimburse for telehealth on par with in-person visits. When this report was issued, we supported the definition of domestic violence to be expanded to include coercive control. This is a bill which passed both houses of the Connecticut General Assembly last week and is on its way now to be signed into law by the governor. We also support the current judicial branch's efforts to make family court more efficient and educated regarding domestic violence. This is also a process which is ongoing. We support the COVID-era policy that restraining orders may be filed remotely and do not require verification by a notary public. This is also still in force. Finally, in the area of education, we support efforts to allocate relief towards college tuition assistance and to establish requirements, including teacher training for virtual learning in order to standardize quality if, God forbid, we go back to remote learning. As with any research, there were unanswered questions after our initial body of data was collected. These questions remain after our report and serve as a basis for further exploration. These are several of the areas that PCSW hopes to explore further. As you heard in several areas of the presentation, Connecticut's Latina population in many areas suffered disproportionately to the pool average. We would like to dig further into the drivers of this. Second, the city of Hartford, which comprises 51 zip codes, bears further exploration. It is our capital city, and for some of the nonprofits operating in Hartford, we're conducting further research on that pool alone. Tulland and Windham counties showed increased housing and food insecurity greater than the pool average. Our work continues to explore these factors in Eastern Connecticut. And finally, we've done significant work with the Office of Early Childhood to dig deeper into our pool of working mothers among the 1,020 to understand better the childcare issues they face, both pre and post-COVID. This concludes the data sharing portion of our report. Again, we would very much like to thank the CWC SEO for all of their support in this work, both in the collection of the data, in featuring our report on their website, and in inviting us to come here today. Thank you.
Tina, thank you. Thank you so much. You know, there's something I think that's remarkably familiar and unfortunately familiar about the data that you're presenting. And it's that we have understood, and it's almost as if we waited with bated breath every time there is calamity or emergency, understanding that the impact is going to be felt disproportionately on women, and particularly on women of color, depending on what the calamity may be in a moment, right? Whether it's a childcare calamity, whether it's health impacts, food insecurity, you hit upon all of the issues. And I want to start, Tony, I'd love for you to ask your question that you typed in the comments openly so that our viewers can hear it, but also so that we can benefit from Tina's response.
My question is this: a lot of what you have reported really reflects a deep and systemic problem. And that is that as a society, we reward fighting and competition very highly, and we do not reward caregiving. And yet our society depends so deeply on women in particular to provide care, loving care, whether that's for our elderly, our children, as teachers, as in healthcare, wherever it is. That's where women work, and that's where the wages are lower, which is one of the major explanations for the lower wages. It's also where the workforce is most unstable, and you can see that in the number of women who lost jobs and were furloughed. Do you have any suggestions for how we can begin to shape this argument so that we don't really build our whole society on the backs of women without paying adequately for what we value in their work?
It is an excellent question, Tony, and it was laid bare by the COVID pandemic because the crisis in childcare, over 90% of childcare workers are women. And so it not only impacted women's ability to work by not having a place to put their children in childcare and continue their work, but those women for whom childcare was their bread and butter virtually lost their income overnight for several months when all of those childcare facilities closed down. I can tell you a few initiatives that are underway to address not only the childcare capacity problem, but the problem that you just described. One is a changing, and this was passed in the Connecticut legislature, I believe in at least one of the houses, but I don't know if by both houses, and that was an allowance for childcare facilities that are in-home, which many are, to not have any additional licensing requirements other than a residential home would have. This assists women business owners in having fewer regulations and hurdles in order to keep their childcare facilities open or to open them de novo. Secondly, in the childcare infrastructure in general, we're talking with the Office of Early Childhood, Commissioner Bai and Commissioner Vanessa Durantes in Department of Children and Families about a real exploration of early childcare as a public good, providing more opportunities for parents, providing more supports and more funding in order to compensate the childcare providers and to really elevate this to an aspect of early childhood education, because it really is that. There are no shortage of studies which show that childcare is essentially the building blocks to education for children. And so there is work being done to really explore how the childcare system can become really an expanded public good. And with that would come an increase in compensation for those that are in that space.
It is still true that people who care for dogs make more money than people who care for children. And it is not just a child care, it's an aging issue as well. Many of the reforms which have encouraged elderly people to stay in their own homes have been based on an assumption that there will be somebody there who will care for them for free. And that is mostly, although not entirely, women.
I'd just like to underscore what both Stephen and Tony have had to say about the fact that this pandemic has really highlighted an issue that has been quite an open sore on the face of the state of Connecticut for quite some time, and suggests that we focus on the fact that we are the only Western nation that does not routinely provide its women with childcare assistance, that routinely does not provide its families with assistance with childcare. And Connecticut has a fabulous opportunity to use this experience as an awakening to begin to lead the vanguard nationally in terms of addressing an issue that plagues all of our 50 states in a way that should not happen in a country so rich in wealth as ours is.
Tina, this really underscores, and thank you for that, Susan. This really underscores, I think, the critical role of women in leadership and women engaged in civics. When women lead, we learn that you can't run for office unless you have childcare assistance, and you should be using part of the resources that you receive as part of the process of running for elected office in order to pay for childcare. We learn that. We learn about how it is that we can change our physical infrastructures in our buildings to make them more receptive to women who are breastfeeding. We learn about wage gaps, right, between men and women. And so what can we, in your recommendations, how is it that we can support more civic engagement and participation by women in the state of Connecticut?
To us, or to the PCSW, I think it starts. I think it starts very young with opening opportunity channels for people's innate abilities and ambitions to carry them as high as possible. And I really would like to see that emphasis and opening up at the opportunities happened at the earliest levels possible. With respect to allowing women to reach positions of leadership, we've made a lot of progress, but it is the case that when more women have voices at the table, that more of their issues just naturally come into the conversation as more women have those experiences. So I believe we've made a lot of progress in this regard. I would love to hear what Susan thinks about this topic.
I think we really need to undergo a paradigm shift in terms of not looking at this as a woman's issue, but looking at this as a societal issue. We shortchange ourselves as a society within the state of Connecticut and elsewhere by not recognizing the loss of talent and the loss of ability for many talented individuals across our state, including women, perhaps women especially, when their energies and resources are divided in terms of taking care of their homes and their children in this case in particular. So if we start changing our thinking to think about all of the productivity that we lose as a state by not supporting the needs of families, the needs of Connecticut residents in terms of helping them with their childcare experiences and needs, then we are losing out on all of the contributions that women in this case can make to our great state.
I have perhaps a follow-up question to something that you raised, Tony, which is the question of the value of work and how it is that we value work in this society. And it seems that having a child or having children and having the women's traditional roles, how we understand them in having children and raising children, are undervalued in the society. And because they're undervalued, there is the gap in that time during which family is developing, so that there is no credit. There's no credit on a resume. There's no credit in the way that we look at work and value work. And that's where partly how loss of income or loss of income over lifetime happens. How do we start addressing how it is that we value work and that we talk about work and industry from the perspective of the work that women are doing in the state of Connecticut?
I have a suggestion for that. And I think the model is what we have done for veterans. We credit veterans in all sorts of ways with having taken several years of their lives to dedicate to preserving the country. They risk their lives for the country, even if they're only operating food services, right? That's the model. Women take years out of their lives and risk their lives for the country, because if we didn't have babies, where would we be as a species? And I mean, that is an argument that I have made for God knows how many years, decades. But it's one that always felt foreign to people when I say that. But if we don't recognize these years of contribution that women make, And again, that is the caregiving at the early part of the life. There's so much other caregiving that's also underpaid and underrecognized. But I think at the very least, we could look at the benefits that are granted to veterans as a way of beginning to recognize the role that women play. But there's also another question that I would like to ask this PCSW, and that is, we're now seeing the women's participation in the workforce lower than it's been since the 1980s, I think. And I'm wondering, do you think this will return? These numbers will return at some when the pandemic is over, or are you worried about it being permanent?
That's a good question, Tony. And we've thought about many of the long-reaching effects that COVID will have. The pandemic is at a point where we've learned to live with it and begin to get on with our lives. But there are going to be effects from this window of time, which has been relatively brief in the total scope of things. That will last for decades to come. I think women will get back into the workforce in large numbers, perhaps even greater numbers. Women have been motivated to retool, to use this time to begin to think about future options and activities. And families will need their women more than ever to be in the workplace to recoup some of the economic losses that families have experienced during this time. So yes, I think that will definitely happen. I think it will have to happen. So that is encouraging on the one hand, but at the same time, we have to make it not so difficult for those women to do what they need to do in the best interest of their families. And again, for the best interest of our state.
The only thing I would add to that are two factors which came out in our forums. The first, I think everyone experienced, was the realization of how much work could be done remotely, and for women that have sought that, and men that have sought that for many years, that was a real revelation. Secondly, a lot of the corporate women that we spoke to indicated the enormous cost savings achieved in their places of work by eliminating, in many cases, business travel, which was a very routine occurrence, but people have realized how much of that, not all of that, but how much of that can be done remotely. So those were two positives in terms of women's and men's ability to balance home and family. But the other theme, I should say, which unfortunately weighs on the negative side, is the significant worry, particularly for working women with children who had special needs, about the backslide of this period of time for those children without the supports of a community and being in person, and the structure provided for ADHD kids and other kids that for whom being physically in school was very important. So I think that some of those women describe themselves in a wait and see mode for September to see if the children go back and how that lost time is made up before making a decision about whether to return to work.
Just to piggyback on that comment, Tina, which I think is very rich and valuable. I think with men being home as well as women, with the disruptions of young children in the home, with the very beautiful and necessary disruptions of having children in the home, it sort of opened our eyes to the difficulties of what it takes for women who in our society are still expected to bear the brunt of the burden of responsibility for childcare, and hopefully we can begin to see the importance of providing childcare as a regular form of assistance to Connecticut women.
I'd like to introduce a subject that I was just beginning to hint on, that is women in the workforce. Even if you have 4 kids, the likelihood that you have children in your home is probably no more than, let's say, 25 years, maybe 30. Well, I'm 78. And there have been a lawful lot of years when I have not had kids in my home, when my life was defined by something other than children. And I really think that I really would like to have some of this discussion focus on something other than women's responsibility for their children. Steve raised a question about women in politics, and we also have been talking about women in the workforce. But I would like you to talk a little bit about what you have found in the survey about women's lives outside of their roles as mothers, because most of us spend most of our lives as something other than mothers.
We have not drilled down on, we have not drilled down on women who are either post-dependent children in the home or the women who do not have, who expressed 0 children in that category. But it's a very worthwhile comment and a group that bears further exploration. We have started to do some analysis of other groups of women outside of this dependent children question. For example, we have some very interesting data on what happened to self-employed women, irrespective of whether they were mothers or had or did not have dependent children. We're working on that analysis now for the Women's Business Development Council. And I can tell you that in that group, which tended to be slightly older, concentrated in the 45 to 65-year-old category, slightly higher educational levels than the pool average, same overall household income level as the pool average, same racial makeup and same geographic makeup. That group suffered, very interestingly, the beta of how much income gained or lost during COVID was more significant than the pool. That is, the average amount of decrease was over $1,000 a month versus the pool average of $500 to $750. So as one would expect, and interestingly also, about 30 or 40% of those self-employed women experienced a $1,000 to $2,000 a month increase in their overall household income. So what that tells us is that when you look at that separate group of women, they had more volatility in the impact of COVID on their earnings stream. They also had more, there was a higher impact on their ability to meet basic expenses. They had a higher level of housing insecurity and food insecurity impact than the pool average, because as you would expect, their income is more volatile. You could imagine scenarios where self-employed women's businesses took off due to COVID and others where they shut down altogether. So I can't speak overall to the pool of women without children, but our work is beginning to focus on other groups in particular. And we actually, to this group, encourage either nonprofits doing work in specific areas or others to seek out the PCSW. We own all our data. We know a lot about our survey respondents, obviously nameless and anonymous, but we can drill down. We did a study on single mothers in our population. We're looking at self-employed women in our population. We're going to do the study on the Eastern Connecticut women in our population. So we would encourage inquiries just of the type you suggested now, Tony.
Given the importance of women as small business owners, it would really be useful, I think, and Melvette has asked this question in her chat. How can the state agencies support women seeking opportunities to work from home and or become small business owners? I think this is a very real question, and I would really like to hear some recommendations for legislative action.
Just to follow up on that, Tony, one of our viewers, and I want to appreciate our viewers on Facebook, one of our viewers said we need more STEM careers for women, noting that those jobs pay very well. And it leads me to the question of, a lot of what we're talking about really in your report and your analysis about the the early impacts or the impacts of having a family, raising a family, and the pressures there have long-term consequences when we don't address them, to your point, Tony. So re-entering the workforce, changing careers, starting new careers, all of those things that can happen in your, as we call in Spanish, tercera edad, which is the third phase of our lives, right? All those opportunities that are missed because of the undervaluing and the under-resourcing of women in a particular stage of their life. So I'd love to see more of that in-depth analysis as well. What are the, we think about how it is that we credit work and we credit industry in various ways. And it really is based on an outmoded model that was created by men coming out of World War II for men coming out of World War II without really understanding the full dynamic of opportunity that our modern reality really allows for.
Well, and in addition, the data has shown over the years that men with children make more money than women with children. That when women take time out of the workforce to care for children, they never make up those lost years in income, which means they never are on the same level with their male counterparts when it comes to retirement. Childcare is a real penalty for women, both professionally and financially, and we bear the burden of it. So I really would like to look more at how women can retrieve their lives after they have spent these wonderful and critical years in caring for very young people.
Tina and Susan, one of your recommendations focuses on the middle class. And when I think about your report and recommendations and the recent report that was released, that is released perennially by the United Way on our ALICE families, asset limited, income constrained, but employed, those families that are living sometimes paycheck to paycheck that were really hurt during COVID, I see a lot of overlap. And I'm wondering, how is it that we can work toward really supporting our middle class so that there is more resilience, not only in our middle class families and women, but also in the infrastructures that are meant to support them, especially during tough times like either calamity or larger issues?
We put, with respect to the issue of childcare, I can say we put as a recommendation in our report, a more fulsome recommendations in the report as a whole about the middle class, because this is a group which both may not be able to afford the private childcare that they wish to afford, to have both parents working, nor are they necessarily eligible for care for kids. So you have this group of people with two working parents who are caught in that squeeze, so to say. And the other thing I should mention about childcare is that having options in early childcare in particular is very important, because at those early ages, some people want a religious element to their childcare. Some people want a particular type of educational approach. Some people want a particular type of language approach to reinforce what the language is spoken at home. So in our report, we have suggested, particularly during COVID, relief subsidies for the middle class in order to preserve that parental choice for people that may not be able to access either ends of the barbell, so to speak.
One of the things that is particularly concerning from my perspective is the way in which Connecticut children who are from ALICE families, who are from lower middle and working class families, has to do with the economic divide reference to the digital divide, and how this particular group of children has really lost out during this time in terms of having their educational experience adversely impacted. It will be a while before these children can catch up in terms of being on top of their schoolwork. They've lost ground and they are at a decided disadvantage compared to their higher socioeconomic status counterparts. So some real strategies of an educational nature to support those children to remediate the opportunities that were lost to them during this time that put them behind the 8 ball, I think is an important thing for us to address. And again, these families are in a position where whatever small cushion they might have had before, I'm sure it has been obliterated, at best strained during the pandemic. And so some kind of economic assistance for those families to put them back on track so that they can have greater economic security for their families, so that they have a little bit of something to fall back on should future hard times hit them.
Thank you for that. You know, that leads to a related question about the way in which you presented your data, which is, I think, what is so powerful about your report is the disaggregating of data, the necessary drilling down into the various ways in which we can look at the data and see where the effect is being felt the most. And that's really, that to me, I think is one of the greatest benefits. Will you continue to disaggregate data in this way? And to the question of one of our viewers, will you disaggregate by disability or by ability? And as you continue to look at these numbers to see how we can drill down even further in ensuring that our assistance is getting where it needs to get, but also opportunities are presented where they need to be.
Yes, we absolutely will. I mean, Susan can tell you, as the social scientists here on this call, you know, we were really pleased with the data we got in 30 questions, but it also made us realize, wow, I wish we'd asked another 50 and gotten this whole other, there were so many questions we wanted to know about, but we also wanted people to take the survey, and they were able to do that, and we got a tremendous response. So the answer to your question is yes, I do think there will be a 2.0. There will be additional questions that we go into the field to seek answers to. One area that I would really like to dig into is we keep saying, several times I cited that across racial and ethnic lines, there was heterogeneity in the data. On one of the questions, which was numbers of women furloughed or who lost their jobs, we took women below the poverty line. And by the way, Latina women had lost their jobs in higher numbers than the pool average. But we took women below the poverty line, and we wanted to see if there was heterogeneity in that level of women for having lost their jobs. And the answer was not that much. So what that told us, then we looked to see the number of Latina women who were concentrated in that lower socioeconomic level in our pool. And there were more Latina women. The percentage of women, Latina women that were in that lower income in our pool was higher. So what that tells us is, you know, we want to look at this question: why did COVID hit that way, the way it hit across racial and ethnic lines? And I think the answer in some cases is going to be it hit against socioeconomic lines. That is really where the rub was. So it raises, unfortunately, a bigger question of why are those racial and ethnic categories concentrated in the lower socioeconomic levels? Raises a much bigger set of questions. But as Susan will tell you, as a social statistician, it's not causal. Because Latina women suffered more in a particular category, for example, it doesn't mean it's because they're Latina. It may mean because they're at a lower socioeconomic level. So long story short, we'd really like to look at that, those two variables against each other across all of our data.
Thank you, Tina. I wonder if you have any reflections on that, Susan.
Yes, this was, in our view, a preliminary study to get a broad scope, broad sweeping sense of the impact on Connecticut's women of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we did, in our view, we've gleaned a lot of rich and informative and invaluable data. And we've started to look more deeply, taking a second and third and ninth and 10th pass at the data to see what clues there are here that will tell us where we need to dig a little bit deeper next. And there are questions that have arisen in the areas that we've talked about. There are also questions, new questions for research inquiry related to mental health and so many other kinds of things that have come out or that have peeked out from the data that we've already gleaned thus far. So yes, we're excited to continue this work and to dig further and on a more granular level, explore this data and try to identify what some of the other rich and compelling questions are deserving of scientific inquiry that there might be.
This reminds me of a experience I had many years ago. I had a friend who was a nurse, and I said to her, "Why did you become a nurse?" And she said, "Oh, it just sort of happened." And she said, "Well, when I was growing up, I really wanted to take over my father's construction company, but he wouldn't hear of it, so I became a nurse." Well, that is not an accident.
Yeah, that's right.
So, the African American and Latina women are very heavily impacted because they work in cleaning services and the buildings closed down. They worked in hospitality and in hotels and those places closed down. That's not an accident where they are. And I think that we really need to raise some significant questions. We obviously need those jobs and they should pay decent wages, right? But one of the questions should be, why is there ethnic, racial disparity in the composition of the people who hold those jobs? It's
Thank you.
not an accident.
There's so many layers there, and I love that you said that it's not an accident, and we shouldn't take the outcome as the answer. The answer is really in the inputs, what's happening early on. There's also our narrative of industry and productivity, how we talk about work. And when I think about when I'm looking on LinkedIn or I'm expecting a certain type of resume, I know the things that we have been trained to look for that LinkedIn, for instance, just as an example, will highlight. Well, how do we talk about the intangibles? How do we talk about volunteer work? How do we talk about, to the point of our Commissioner Hilda Nieves on Facebook, how do we talk about credit for community engagement, for consulting work? How do we talk about those things that are not traditional, that may be done by women, but that we are not crediting as a society? It feels to me like we should be leading that conversation.
How do you credit an ability to be a caregiver? This takes me back to my original question. Lovingness and empathy are not given any credit anywhere.
Just to pick up on your last point, Stephen, it is an issue of equity. There are certain economic sectors that are the only ones available to certain categories of women and men in our society. And in this particular case of the pandemic, those occupational spheres and industry were the hardest hit ones. So I think we have to look at not only the fact that, in this case, Latinx women were more hard hit than some other women from an economic standpoint. We have to look at the fact that they are women who struggle in the best of times because their limited access, because the lack of equity of access to certain kinds of educational and career opportunities that are available to Latinx and Black and other traditionally underrepresented racial ethnic groups of individuals in our state.
Well, thank you all. And I really, firstly, I want to, again, appreciate what I believe is an ongoing conversation about the data that you're finding, about the research that you are continuing to really try and figure out not only where those pressure points are in the state of Connecticut for women, but how it is that we can start learning from those experiences, those experience pressure points, so that we can start addressing them at every level, whether it's at the policy level, at the local level, whether it's through resourcing or opportunity building, all of the various ways in which we are addressing what we know to be persistent and historical disparities that really burden and fall upon women. So I want to give you the opportunity just to give us one parting gift to our viewers and to those who may be listening. As you know, we will continue to rebroadcast today's conversation. So please share this conversation where you will. Links to the full report will be on our site so that you can access them both through the web, Facebook site. We'll also edit it in so that if you're watching this on other media, you'll be able to see the link to the report in full by the Permanent Commission on the Status of Women in Connecticut. I'd love to give each of you an opportunity for some parting thoughts. Tina.
Well, thank you, Steve. The data obviously painted a fairly disruptive and grim picture. There's no question how much people suffered, but and we have great empathy for all of that in so many ways. What I would like to end with, however, is that it also presented a significant amount of opportunity. COVID was so disruptive, and as other disruptive forces, it provided us an opportunity to rethink how we work, how we go to school, which there were a lot of negatives for a lot of kids about remote learning, but it did disrupt that model too and focus on some things that can be improved. There's a lot of federal stimulus money being dedicated in Connecticut to some of the issues that were highlighted by this report. And that presents us with a 2-year window of opportunity to use those funds to pilot things that we may never otherwise have been able to pilot and see how we can make some changes. So what I would like to leave with is thank you to all of those who supported our work by taking the survey. Thank you to the CWCSEO, and a focus on the forward-looking opportunities that were presented by this crisis.
Thank you, Tina. Susan. Seems that Susan may have frozen. Tony.
Well, there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm really pleased that these two organizations are working together. And I do hope that we begin to take some of these lessons and move into the future with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you. And I want to appreciate each of you as well. And Tina, I know we lost Susan due to technical difficulties, but please thank her again for us. And please know that you have a partner in us as a policy shop in this legislature to continue to work with you and support you in the work that you do. And we're just so grateful that we have one more powerful voice continuing in the Permanent Commission to really serve our thinking and serve our progress. So thank you so much for being here today, and we will reconvene soon, I'm sure. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Steve.